Step right up and play the shell game. It's easy. Just watch the pea, and watch my hands, and watch the shells. You can't lose. Well, the con men who played this game never lost because they used sleight of hand to get rid of the pea. But little did they know that the walnut shell that they used to cover the pea was an expression of one of nature's cleverest ideas. You see, nature doesn't need a frame to enclose space. No, the strength is in the surfaces themselves, and sometimes these surfaces can be very thin. Not only that, but the walnut shell has developed an edge beam along each half so that it will remain strong even though there's a weak joint in between to allow the seed inside to get out and germinate. But nature, of course, still uses the space frame in its construction of living things. The human skeleton is a space frame, enclosing our vital organs, and then it's covered with skin. But the skeleton is more than that. Our most precious organ is protected not by the frame, but by a shell. The brain is almost completely enclosed in a shell of bone.
The examples of shells in living systems are virtually limitless. Seashells in astounding variety serve as houses for the soft marine animals that live inside them. Insects are covered in a hard exoskeleton, a shell of protein that protects their squishy inner parts. But the most famous shell of all is the egg. Animals like birds use the thin but strong eggshell to protect the embryos of their young. I can illustrate just how strong this eggshell is. Let's throw this raw egg and see what happens. Not bad. Let's try another one. Two out of two. Let's go for a third. We're on a roll. One more for luck. So the shell is strong, thin, and relatively lightweight. And the second thing we have to know about shells is a message we've actually heard before. Shape is very important. Part of the efficiency for the eggshell is its shape. And the neat thing about shells is that they can be both enclosure and structure at the same time. Now, to be fair, we have many man-made small shell structures all around us. Containers of all kinds, from tin cans to glass jars, are shells. So is a light bulb, a city bus, even this canoe.
But if we want to enclose very large spaces using shell structures, in other words, go one better than nature, then we have problems. In fact, two really big ones. The first is that we have trouble building in even the simplest of curved shapes. The second is that until this century, we didn't have a material like reinforced concrete that was not only thin and strong, but was also capable of taking all the forces on a structure, tension as well as compression. Let me set the scene for the evolutionary development of the shell. For thousands of years, arches, vaults, domes, using primarily compression, were about the limit of man-made curved structures. Everything else was based on straight lines. It's hardly surprising then that for our first crack at shells, man turned his attention to the curved structures he already knew something about.
The simplest of modern shells is the barrel shell, which derives from the barrel vault. At first sight, they look identical, but there is a significant difference. We saw before that the barrel vault is simply an arch extruded into the third dimension and sitting on the ground. This kind of vault spans from there to there. However, if you tried to support it at just the four corners, the vault would collapse. But with a barrel shell, we're now talking about making use of the whole shape, spanning from there to there. By using a material like reinforced concrete, we can hold it up using just the four corners. That means it acts in some ways like a beam, where it's nearly vertical, and like a slab near the top, where it's almost horizontal. Here's an example covering a downtown subway entrance. And another one, this time made out of plexiglass. Now, nature found a way to make barrel shells millions of years ago. A bird's beak is a barrel shell. But look at the end of the beak, as well as its length. Most beaks have a tip on the end. So if we look at the beak from the side, it's a shell along its length, but it also curves on the end in a different direction. That's what we call a doubly curved shell.
Nature often uses the most efficient shell to do a specific job, like the non-spherical eggshell. What we would like to do is the same thing with our structures. Let me show you what I mean. I've got several pieces of wire here, bent into different shapes. And in this bowl, yes, a mixture of detergent and water. Now, you probably think I'm going to blow bubbles. Well, not exactly. Although studying bubbles can tell us an awful lot about shells. No, I'm going to dip these shapes into the solution and look at the specific shape that the soap film takes up. It is, in fact, a minimum surface. That is the minimum amount of soap film necessary to cover that space and support its own weight. Let's try a few more. This is one of the most interesting ones. It is, in fact, a hyperbolic paraboloid. And that's a bit of a mouthful, I know, and it doesn't matter what it's called. The point is, it curves in several directions at the same time. But it's also a minimum surface. In other words, it uses the least amount of soap film to cover a specific area. But what's absolutely amazing is that a shape as complex as this can actually be constructed using nothing more than straight lines.
Now, it's a marvellous thing that a hyperbolic paraboloid can be constructed from a series of straight lines. In a way, it's merely a restatement of the fact that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. In this case, an infinite number of them, defining what is otherwise a complex curved surface. And it's marvellous because it gives us the key for actually constructing shells involving such complex curves. Because before you can make any shell or dome out of reinforced concrete, you have to make it first in something else to hold the concrete up in the air whilst it's still wet and runny. Now, with a spherical dome, every line drawn on its surface in any direction will be a curve. So the formwork would have to be curved too. But with a hyperbolic paraboloid, you can make all the formwork out of straight pieces of timber. So the hyperbolic paraboloid, or saddle shape, is very close to the minimal surface needed to enclose a space. As a roof, it would drain itself, since there isn't a horizontal surface on it. It is an extremely efficient shape, and we are now learning to use shells made in this way. The Astrodome in Calgary is one example. Now, we could also just use a part of the shape and make it work like a more traditional roof. A famous example is the TWA Terminal at Kennedy Airport in New York. It uses 4 shell pieces to make its dramatic roof. Now, with the advent of computers that can calculate the most efficient shell structures, architects are able to use other complex curved shapes, like the cooling towers at power stations. This shape actually helps disperse the vapour coming out of the top by creating updrafts. And you'll be surprised at just how far we can go. These remarkable shell structures were created by Felix Candela, a Spanish-Mexican architect and engineer. Although he didn't invent the reinforced concrete shell, his pioneering work has made his name synonymous with hyperbolic paraboloids. He built his first shell structure in 1949, and within just 2 years, he had gained worldwide recognition. Over his career, he has successfully made thinner and thinner reinforced concrete shells, sometimes only a few centimetres thick, but spanning up to 40 metres. His trademark is to reveal this incredible thinness at the exposed edges. Candela claims that shell construction is the beginning of architecture, because architecture is the shaping of space, not just the copying of the past. Like most architects, he considers architecture unique because, he points out, it is an art that is also a science. Unfortunately, in northern climates, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to build thin shells like Candela's, because we have to consider additional loads, such as snow and seasonal temperature variations.
So the shell is an extremely efficient way to cover spaces with a strong structure. And we've also seen that nature makes extensive use of shells. But we still have a problem with the limitation of size. And it's a problem because we have this incredible fascination with the great indoors. We always seem to want more and more of it, preferably all in the same place. Undoubtedly, that's because we prefer to be protected from the elements. Now, I'm talking about really big indoor spaces, not like this planetarium here, which can house 350 people. No, I mean stadia that could house 60 or 70,000 raving fans, and a field, and a couple of football or baseball teams. Now, unfortunately, even reinforced concrete can't usually be made thin enough and certainly lightweight enough to support itself over such large areas. The bigger reinforced concrete domes tend to be about 50 metres or so in diameter. Oh, that's big, but not big enough. What we need to develop is a lightweight technology of curved construction to cope with the really big.
If we were to look again at the truss and even the space deck, one of the keys to the success of these structures was that they used many straight pieces that were all the same size. That made the actual construction much simpler. The space deck is the resulting structure that lets us cover large spaces, such as in airplane hangars and factories. The strength comes from triangulation in 3 dimensions. Well, what if we could combine our technological know-how from straight line structures, that is the efficiency of mass producing many bits of the structure that are the same size, with triangulation in 3 dimensions and with the shapes that we have called shells? Well, in fact, it's very possible. We have devised construction techniques that use a kind of skeleton and skin structure to mimic the curved efficiency of the shell on a large scale. Yet it's a space frame because it uses a lot of very small, and this is the important point, straight members.
This is the new domed stadium under construction in Toronto. And the stadium is unique in that part of its domed roof will be retractable. Even though people like to keep the rain off their heads, it's Nice to let the sun shine in too, the best of both worlds, indoors and outdoors at the same time. Now, that's easy to say, but not so easy to achieve. So to solve the problem of spanning a large space with a structure that will be strong enough to hold itself up and light enough to be retractable, the engineers and architects turned their attention to a type of structure known as the lattice dome. Now, I know I've spoken about domes previously, but not the lattice dome. Its structure is more closely related to the shell. And like the shell, it's light in weight, not heavy. It can span very large areas, and it's made up of straight members. Now, there are many different types of lattice dome, but they can all be understood by this simple demonstration.
We are all familiar with the globe of the world, with its lines of latitude which go around this way, parallel with the equator, and the lines of longitude which pass through the two poles. The lines of longitude are called the great circles, and what's important about them is that they are all the same size. That is, they all have the same diameter as the globe itself. The lines of latitude, however, are called the small circles because they are concentric and only the one at the equator has the diameter of the globe. All the others are smaller. We could see that if we looked down from above the North Pole. Well, we could make a model of this globe by constructing these circles from small straight pieces joined together. If this is done for both the small and great circles, and each of the rectangle-like shapes is strengthened by straight diagonal members, then we have the simplest of lattice domes called the Schwedler. The diagonals, of course, give the triangulation needed for stability and strength and form the characteristic spiral pattern. To make a dome, you just have to cover this skeleton with a lightweight material. The Houston Astrodome uses this kind of construction. It's one of the biggest domes in the world. Now, there is a drawback to this particular design. There are a great number of different sized pieces. Such a design doesn't make full use of the potential of mass production of the structural elements. Mind you, it still makes a good dome. So a further development was to replace the great circle elements with a zigzag pattern of members, making a set of equilateral triangles for each small circle. But all the triangles are not the same size, so there are still many different sized elements. The Cinesphere at Ontario Place is just such a dome. Now, imagine how economical construction would become if all the members could be the same size. The solution to this problem was the development of the geodesic dome by Buckminster Fuller, where all the triangles are the same size and shape. Here's how it works. Let's draw two great circles which pass through the North Pole and intersect at an angle of 60 degrees. Now, precisely where we put a great circle on a sphere is completely arbitrary. So we can rotate our sphere a bit and put a new great circle here. If we draw it so that it makes a 60-degree angle to the two other circles, we end up with an equilateral triangle, where all the sides are the same length. By carefully choosing the locations of more intersecting great circles, we can generate more equilateral triangles that will completely cover the surface of the sphere. All the curved lines are replaced by straight ones. Now, we don't always need all these members, so some of them can be left out, leaving ourselves with primarily six-sided shapes, or hexagons, where all the members remain the same length. That is the essence of the geodesic dome. Now, circles don't appreciate being broken down into straight lines. It has to do with a number you might have heard of called pi. The result is that there are always some bits left over, and they form a few five-sided shapes or pentagons on the surface. The more great circles we draw, the more we create triangles and hexagons. But no matter how many we have, there will always be 12 pentagons, no fewer, no more. This soccer ball, for instance, has just 20 hexagons and 12 pentagons. Soccer balls are made like geodesic domes because this design produces the same lengths for all the straight sides, so the stitching will be stressed evenly. The geodesic dome is the closest man has yet come to making a complete sphere out of a triangulated arrangement of straight pieces, all the same length. But before we get carried away at the ingenuity of civilization for thinking up this marvel of construction, we must look again at nature. This is a common housefly, the kind you get the bug spray out for. Well, if we look at the fly's eye very closely, we'll see that it is built on the same principle as a geodesic dome. Even one of the most primitive life forms of all, the sponge, mimics the structure of the geodesic dome. Many of Bucky's domes have been built, but of course we all remember the dome of the American Pavilion at Expo 67 in Montreal. There are also radomes in the far north that protect early warning radar from the elements. But these weren't the first uses of the technique. The skeleton of the famous Wellington Bomber from the Second World War, whilst not a dome, used the geodesic method to create curved surfaces. It used thousands of short lengths of aluminum, all of the same length. These were assembled into wings and fuselage. More than 10,000 Wellingtons were built this way, and there were more of these built than any other Allied bomber during the Second World War. The reason for using a geodesic structure was that it made the inside of the airplane big enough to carry large bomb loads, without making the enclosing structure heavy and unwieldy. The more traditional aircraft of the day had stringers and bulkheads inside, which is airplane talk for posts and beams, and they took up much of the space. So the Wellington was a distinct improvement. There were some other consequences to the unusual design. The aircraft could be built in prefabricated pieces and assembled away from the factories. These pictures are taken from a film showing a Wellington being constructed in under 24 hours. But the geodesic structure also made the airplane quite flexible. Wellington crews often told stories of looking from the tail gunner's turret up to the front of the airplane and not being able to see it because the tail was bending so much. But the real significance of using this construction method came from something the designers hadn't at first considered. The geodesic structure allows the loads on the aircraft to be distributed in many different directions. In other words, the loads are carried not by just a few beams, but by all the members of the structure. That is true of all geodesic structures. But in the Wellington, it was a vitally important feature. It meant that the Wellington Bomber could sustain a lot of damage from anti-aircraft fire or enemy planes and not fall apart. Amazingly, these planes made it back because the bits of the structure that remained had enough strength to carry the entire load. Sadly, the most prolific bomber of the Second World War has not survived nearly so well in peacetime. There are only 2 Wellingtons left in the world. So we can look at structures now, whether they're airplanes, streetcars, bridges, or buildings, as being either shells or space frames. Sometimes, of course, they're a combination of both.
Nevertheless, these 2 ideas, the space frame and the shell, govern just about everything in structures when we want to enclose space here on Earth. They are the 2 main ways of doing so. And sometimes one's more appropriate than the other. Just depends what you want your structure to do. Perhaps the development of the automobile offers the best illustration of this idea. We can look at this early car and see that it is a sort of space frame. Has a series of straight members, triangulated to some extent, and covered with the fabric of one sort or another. And it's great. It's a triumph of structural design. And the space frame gives it light weight. And that was essential.
The internal combustion engines that had to power those early cars were not exactly what you call powerful. Getting a car to go at any speed was difficult. But while the space frame is light, it does have one drawback. It's not very stiff. Now that's all right when you're riding at low speed over bumpy roads. A little give and take helps smooth out the ride, but as speeds got faster and faster, with better engines and smoother roads, a flexible twisting structure was completely undesirable. The way to prevent it was to use a shell construction with holes drilled out to conserve weight. The result was called the monocoque, and today it dominates the design of automobiles. Nevertheless, the space frame is making a comeback in transportation, and it's happening in, of all places, the sky. We just have to look at hang gliders and ultralights. With these craft, the speeds are so low that bending and twisting are not a problem, but weight is. It's aircraft going back to their roots. The first airplanes were space frames, little more than sticks, canvas and string. Is it surprising then that the first human-powered aircraft, the Gossamer Condor, was a space frame, but the fastest aircraft in the sky are shells? So once again, the lesson is shells will always be stiffer, but space frames will always be lighter.
But space frames and shells aren't quite everything. There are some structures that take tension to its logical extreme and also give us the lightest structures of all. Those are the suspension systems. They're also extremely flexible and in some eyes, potentially, the most beautiful structures in the world. That's the topic of our next programme. The suspension of disbelief. Now I've got to get out of this. There we go. Huh. Now that's an interesting vertical cantilever. The horizontal. Oh. I can't hang around all day.